Hey everybody, it's Matty C. In case you don't know me, I'm a longtime fan, supporter, and occasional volunteer for Stand Up. Pete was kind enough to allow me to take a minute to tell you about my upcoming house concert tour. I'll be playing a series of intimate acoustic shows across the eastern U.S. in the first half of July. These shows are happening in backyards, historic buildings, recording studios, and even the former site of a World's Fair. I'll be playing songs from throughout my long career in the stick-arounds, Harbor Coat, and the Pantones. It has been a lifelong dream of mine to go on a tour like this and earn a part of my income from my music. This is an exciting but terrifying leap, and I would love it so much if you would join me out there and support me at one of these stops. You can find more information and all of the dates at phono4records.com/house shows. Pete, thank you so much for letting me share. I really appreciate it. Cheers, y'all. Matty C.
Hello and welcome to the weekend episode of Stand Up. Joining me today, Professor Eric Segall, who I talked to about several of the Supreme Court decisions that have just come down, as well as a very important Fifth Circuit case that will apparently allow businesses to discriminate against folks because of their sexual orientation. So really disturbing stuff, as always, but a great conversation with Eric Segall, as always. He, of course, is a constitutional law scholar at Georgia State University, the author of Supreme Myths and Originalism as Faith, and the host of the podcast Supreme Myths, which he is continuing to drop great episodes of, and you should subscribe to. Follow him on Twitter and TikTok. All the information about Eric is in today's show notes, and I cannot do this without your support. Completely independent media journalism efforts here, trying every day to talk with the smartest people in the world about the issues that matter the most to you, your family, your community, your country, and your planet. That's my tagline. I need to say it more, they would tell me. But there is no they. It's just us. So sign up now. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Here now, Eric Segall, the Legal Eagle.
And we are officially recording. There he is. Eric Segall joining me now, the Legal Eagle. And we have lots to talk about, don't we?
The Legal Eagle's wings have been clipped, but that's a different conversation.
You mean because you hurt your shoulder?
Yes, there's no more flying for me. I don't mean that literally, but I'm not soaring as high as I once did.
There are several things that you really want to talk about. There's one thing that I just want to definitely ask you about real quick, and this is a case from 10 days ago. Of course, it's June, the Supreme Court. Everybody's hearing about it and reading about it and trying to interpret it. But the Supreme Court ruled against Alabama Republicans, requiring the state to redraw congressional districts in support of greater representation of black voters. And the ruling surprised a lot of civil and voting rights activists because people thought the Roberts Court, who you've taught us has been hostile to voting rights, would further disenfranchise voters of color. But that's not what happened.
So the best legal minds out there who have studied this have suggested that the reason the conservatives, Roberts and Kavanaugh, went with the liberals on this, and they picked up, and Barrett too, I think. The reason for that is the lawyering for the state of Alabama was so bad and so terrible that it offended Justice Roberts' sensibilities. That's one theory. I think there's probably a part of that because, above all, Roberts is a snob. But this case is important. I don't want to say it's unimportant, but given what Shelby County did to the Voting Rights Act, it is kind of like a pail trying to hold the flood back. And the other thing is, Pete, and maybe Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett saw this. I'll give them credit for it. Maybe they saw this. Alabama has been so notoriously awful for so many years in using violence, intimidation, character tests, every way possible to stop blacks from voting. The racism in Alabama is well documented. In Justice Ginsburg's dissent in Shelby County itself, she talked about something that was irrelevant to the case, but just to show how much racism there was left in Alabama. So this is 2010, so it's not a long time ago. Alabama was considering putting a gambling initiative on its ballot, and a bunch of congressmen got together, about state senators got together in Alabama and said, we can't do this. We cannot let this ballot initiative go to the people, not because they were opposed to gambling, because it would have increased black turnout. And in that conversation, they said, God, we can't have blacks coming out to vote. That would be terrible. They also, Pete, and I apologize, trigger alert here, I'm about to say a bad word. They call these representatives from the Alabama government called black people Aborigines and other things. So that was 2010. So the racism in Alabama is so prevalent in government that this map was so obviously drawn in a racist way to make sure that there would only be one congressman from Alabama as opposed to two, which there really should be. So I don't want to. I give them some credit. Let's not do that. I mean, I'm glad they ruled this way, but it's not a big deal compared to Shelby County.
Okay, so it's not like it's fixing what they already broke and gutted. No, it's they didn't make it that much worse. Okay,
correct.
I know you wanted then to talk about not a Supreme Court case decision, but a Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision that said that the U.S. Equal Opportunity Employment Opportunity cannot deny this company, Braidwood Management, an exemption from anti-discrimination policies designed to protect LGBTQ plus people from discrimination under Title VII of the Federal Civil Rights Act. Again, this is a case where a federal agency cannot force this Texas-based conservative Christian business to comply with policies that ban or bar discrimination against people and their own employees or job applicants because of their sexual orientation, how they identify.
Yes, but let's back up. You might remember a few years ago, there was this big case. There's a federal statute that prohibits employment discrimination based on race, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And the language there is you can't discriminate against somebody because of sex. And Justice Gorsuch, of all people, wrote a majority opinion saying that statute prohibited employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and transgender status. So that was a huge victory for liberals. It made the right really mad at Justice Gorsuch. It was not a constitutional question. It was what does this federal statute mean? And it turns out this federal statute prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation. But in that opinion, Justice Gorsuch dropped this nugget, this exception, this little idea. And he said, of course, nothing we're saying in this case addresses whether an employer who makes a religious objection to hiring somebody because of their sexual orientation.
The bigotry is always based on your religious objections. Hey, listen, you're discriminating against me because you're telling me that my God is wrong to discriminate against gay people, right?
Well, what Gorsuch was doing there was laying the framework for this case today. And this is what I want to say about it. So again, we have two federal statutes. One statute says you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And then we have another statute called RFRA, which people will remember from the Hobby Lobby days, that says that if a federal law makes you do something you don't want to do and it substantially burdens your religious exercise, then you can get an exemption unless, and this is the key to this case, unless the government has a compelling interest in doing what it's doing and is using means that are narrowly tailored to further that interest. What these Fifth Circuit judicial bigots said was the government did not have a compelling interest in fighting discrimination based on sexual orientation. And I want to go further, Pete. The employer in this case was very honest. He was honestly evil. He said, and it's a for-profit company.
His name is Stephen Hotsey. He's a conservative activist in Texas who helped defeat the proposed non-discrimination protections for gay and transgender people in Houston. And that company that you're talking about, he's also a plaintiff in a suit that's presided over similar judges that seeks to limit Affordable Care Act insurance coverage requirements for various types of preventative care, including drugs to prevent HIV.
But my point here, that's true. My point here is this is not a church. In other words, I'm not going to make churches hire people churches don't want to hire. I think now I would take taxes and status away from them if they don't fall. That's a different conversation. But this is not about churches. This is a for-profit company run by a religious man. That's not the same thing as a church, obviously. And he said, not just saying, it used to be in the same-sex marriage days, I have nothing against homosexuals. I have nothing against homosexuality. I just don't want people of the same sex getting married because it offends traditional marriage in some way that no one ever understood with that evil hate and bigotry involved.
Yeah.
This man is going further. This man is saying, I don't like homosexuals. I don't like homosexual behavior. I don't want them on my property. I don't want them working for me. So this is pure hate. This is not traditional marriage or kid. This is pure, I don't like homosexuals. Maybe he'd be okay with homosexuals who don't have sex. I don't know. That's the traditional Catholic line. But he doesn't want homosexuals working for him, gays and lesbians working for him. So this is, and then he says, I don't have to because of this other federal law that gives me an exemption based on religion, except that law only applies if the government doesn't have a compelling interest. And what everybody leading up to this litigation thinks and says is, if this guy said, I don't like black people, if he said, I don't want black people working for me and I'm not going to hire black people, this same court of the Texas Fifth Circuit, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, they would have said the government has a compelling interest in fighting racism. I have no doubt about that, because they wouldn't be able to say in 2023. Right. But they're not willing to say that about sexual orientation and transgender status. And that's just wrong, immoral, terrible, evil. And the Fifth Circuit upheld it. And I think the Supreme Court is going to uphold it too. And what that does is it takes Bostock and it drives a huge hole through that case. And it undoes, because it's not hard, Pete, for someone to say, or even a board of directors to say, we run a for-profit company, it's worth $3 billion. And like Hobby Lobby, we have religious objections to this, that, and the other thing. And one of our religious objections is to homosexual conduct, and we don't want gays and lesbians working for us. And then Bostock goes away and no longer has any.
And I mean, it's important to mention how different the two culture war things that are at play with Hobby Lobby and with this case are abortion, and in this case, LGBT, anti-discrimination against LGBT people. So the Hobby Lobby, they didn't want to have to pay for insurance for their employees that covered reproductive rights, abortion, etc. And so that's one war. They didn't want to have to pay for that, cover their employees for that. And now this one is employers can discriminate against people. They can fire them or not hire them as a result of their sexual orientation.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's an organized strategy by the religious right to use the courts to be able to discriminate.
Now, I'm so glad, Pete, you are brilliant as always. A strategy by the religious right. That is the segue we need to get us right into Justice. I want to say a bad word so badly. Justice Alito, who I like alliteration when I talk to you guys. When I talk, I like alliteration.
Okay, go ahead. We'll use some, for God's sake. Quit stammering.
There's a word that rhymes with class that I really wanted to use.
Oh, come on. Too easy. Well, wait, hold on. Before you get to name calling, do I have to have gay people in my home, or can I reject them from...
You can reject gay people in your home.
Oh.
Because you're a private person, and the First Amendment, well, it's immoral for you to do that, but you're legally allowed to do that.
What if they're in my home, we're out on the deck, and then I find out that they're gay, like I didn't know, can I then ask them to leave?
Yeah, but even worse, you can employ them, not know they were gay, and fire them the second you find out they were gay, according to this. It's unbelievable.
You took my joke and made it a very serious situation, which was perfect. All right, Alito. I
want to go big here. We're going to go big.
Let's go big.
Going big.
Big time.
I'm in that kind of mood. I'm in the mood to go big, Pete. So, as everyone who's listening to this podcast, I'm sure knows, 3 days ago, ProPublica, the magazine that exposed Justice Thomas's lollygagging with billionaires on yachts and planes, last Friday they sent Justice Alito an email.
And having them know those are the last two bad things. The fact that he went on trips with them is bad. He let the billionaires paying his mother's rent and buying his house, paying his bills is more. Start there. Go ahead.
Hey, Pete, I want to. Okay, I listen to Dan Le Batard's show all the time, and someday my dream is on there, as you know. They know of me. They haven't asked me yet, but they have a thing called "Look at Me, Louie." When somebody name drops, they play a song "Look at Me, Louie" as a way to stop name dropping. I'm going to tell you that I wrote a blog post, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, on Justice Thomas, called Justice Thomas's Greatest Hits, that reported what ProPublica reported a few months ago, and no one paid attention to it. Surely.
Your look at me, Louie, is about yourself.
Yes. I reported all that Thomas stuff 2 or 3 years ago, and no one paid attention.
Yeah, you are, but, a lot more people are coming to meet you where you've been at for a long time on the court not being a court and justices not being judges, and you're not getting credit for that either.
Well, I am getting some credit for that, but I'm not looking for credit. I want to reform the court. That's my only goal.
Okay, well, egos aside.
You used the phrase right-wing strategy to undercut Bostock and get employers to be able to discriminate against gays and lesbians. And that's why everything that's happening with Alito and Thomas is so important. So ProPublica writes Alito and says, we're going to do this story next week. Do you want to comment on it? He does not respond to them. Instead, and it's about a fishing trip he took in 2006 or 2008, I believe, private jet, luxury accommodations. He doesn't report it, with another billionaire who has all kinds of business before the court. And crucially, Pete, I think, he writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal responding to these charges he really hadn't seen yet or hadn't seen in detail. And here's what's so important about that. Here's the key thing that's getting a little underplayed. Guess who put together Sam Alito and this billionaire singer whose company 6 years later won a $2.4 billion judgment in front of the Supreme Court?
You said billionaire singer, billionaire named Paul Singer. And the answer is Leonard Leo. He basically hooks, he hooks up, he gets them on the court, and then he gives them a billionaire to look after them.
And then it's worse, because through that information, through those connections, there's been everybody has heard about ALEC, ALEC capitals, that destroyed public schools in this country as much as possible. That's the goal of ALEC, is to destroy public schools.
Not all they've done.
No, but that's part of what they've done. But it's an organized. They send statutes out to the states that are anti-LGBTQ, anti-public.
They write laws, give them the state lawmakers, and the state lawmakers basically copy and paste them. Yeah.
So all of this is tied to the same group of billionaires: the Koch brothers, Leonard Leo, this guy Singer, a bunch of others. And these billionaires, we always knew they donated to the Federalist Society. We always knew they donated to Heritage. We always knew that these billionaires were behind all of this. What we didn't really know, with as much detail as we do now, is they've actually been wining and dining the judges at the same time. So in 2006, Scalia and Thomas, or in the mid-2000s, both went to Koch brothers retreats not to give talks, not to go fishing, not to go hunting, as Scalia often did with Koch brother type people, but simply to attend. In fact, neither before Scalia died, and to this day, neither, and Justice Thomas, who's still alive, kind of, has never, ever explained what they were doing at those political gatherings. Those weren't hunting trips. Those weren't fishing trips. Those were just political people getting together to talk about politics and have fun. So what's becoming clear now, and is a little bit different than we knew in the past, although, of course, what's her name, Jane Mayer, who wrote Dark Money, the organization Fix the Court, which I'm very close to and work with. Gabe, I'm having a senile moment on his last name. Gabe does great work on that organization. But what we're learning now is these billionaires have been working on two different levels. On the one level, they sponsor ALEC and other groups that understand legislation and understand how to get laws passed, and funding the Federalist Society's efforts to get conservative judges on the court, and wining and dining Supreme Court judges Alito, Thomas, et cetera, and Scalia when he was alive. I mean, fuck it. Scalia died on a hunting trip paid for by people with business before the court. So this is really bad stuff. And so, it's interesting. So I had a meeting the other day, I don't mind saying this on the air, with a former assistant you put me in touch with him, Sheldon Whitehouse. In fact, you brought us together. Alex Aronson is his name. He was on your show.
Alex was on the show a couple weeks ago. I did not know that you guys met. I'm very happy and proud that I brokered that.
You did. And Alex and I had a very long talk. And because I've been watching Sheldon Whitehouse closely, because he's the best politician in the country on these issues, and has been for a long time. And I've always thought, as much as I love what the senator is doing, and I do, he's focused a little too much on the money and not as much on other things. But now I'm starting to get it. Now I'm starting to see why. And Pete, when I wrote Originalism is Faith, one of my closest friends and smartest people I know, who's not a lawyer but is extremely knowledgeable about politics and current events, read my draft book. And he said, Eric, this is, he was very positive about it, but he said, I want you to do something for me, which I know you won't do. And I said, what's that? He said, take out the chapter on Randy Barnett and all these other academics that I know you care about and you have to care about because you're an academic, but no one else cares about. And no one reading your book other than law professors is going to care about it. And replace that chapter with dark money, with Jane Mayer's work, with the fact that Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas and Kavanaugh, Barrett wasn't there yet. I'm not even sure Kavanaugh was there. But we know they were in the pipeline. They're all being funded by dark money. And that's the real problem. And I said, I can't change it at this time. It's not my deal with the publisher. And I don't have the information right now. But now I get why he was saying that, because he knows he knew something then I knew but didn't really know, Pete, which is this conglomeration of billionaires who run the conservative part of this country. I'm not sure where Trump fits in, other than obviously Trump said to them, I'll give you whatever judges you want. You pick the judges. Trump said to Leo, you pick the judges, which he did. Leo sat in the White House physically and picked the judges. Oh, here's the executive office building, but same thing. So what's going on with Alito here is it's more evidence that these billionaires are really funding these justices. And here's the last thing. Someone made this point on Twitter just before we came on air to me, or just before we started taping this, excuse me. He said, the thing is, what Alito said in his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal is the same thing Thomas said, and it's the same thing that Justice Roberts said in 2011 when he wrote his year-end report on the issue of Supreme Court judges recusing themselves, ethics codes, and et cetera. And what Roberts said in 2011 was, trust us. That's all. What Alito said was, you got to trust me. I know what's best and I know what's appropriate. What Thomas said is, I wouldn't sit in any case where I thought I was compromised, and I haven't done it. But Pete, we don't extend that courtesy of trust to any other judge in the United States. Every other judge in America has some other entity looking over its shoulders when he or she decides to recuse or not to recuse. And they are the justices, and even the liberal ones, are so, I don't know, horrible on this, trust us. Well, you're politicians. We don't trust. We trust but verify. Like we do trust politicians. We trust but verify. We have no verification process on the Supreme Court, and that rooster is coming home to roost. And Alito sat on a case where a $2.4 billion, now his vote didn't matter, it was 7-1, but nevertheless, he sat on a case where someone who paid for his private fishing luxury trip company received $2.4 billion. And that is just not something judges do. It's not something judges ought to do. And his response is, I was not conflicted, trust me. And that's not a response we allow in.
The jokes about that are pretty funny, about some equivalent of that in anybody else's life.
Richard Nixon, I have the tapes. Trust me. They're not going to hurt. There's nothing wrong with
Well,
tapes.
saying that's different than saying I'm not conflicted here. Okay. It seems like you would be. It seems like you would be conflicted in this case because I'm just saying you're human. This case.
Right. But it's not even that. It goes bigger than that. And this is why, and by the way, there is, to the best of my knowledge, sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, a very good organization is going to distribute I guess you call it a podcast, but it's very long in various parts, with Sheldon Whitehouse, with myself, with Akil Lamar of Yale Law School, and somebody else, on the whole connection between the Fellow Society, the conservative judges, and money.
Great.
It is still the case today, Pete. It is still the case that if you go to the Fellow Society website and go to their FAQs, frequently asked questions, they still deny supporting people for public office. And it's an unbelievable thing. Think about it. I mean, it's just, it's an unconscionable lie. And I have so many friends in the Federalist Society who I respect and who, if they're on this show, would give us fair, honest opinions about these things. But they seem to have this blind spot that their organization still claims to be nonpartisan. They claim to be a nonpartisan organization when only when they get a lot of money from the rank and file. Right. But their real money comes from conservative billionaires who have Alex's best interests at heart. I mean, it's an incredible thing.
Going back to whether or not a judge should recuse themselves at any level, generally speaking, it's because somehow, somewhere, there's a conflict of interest.
No, it's not. It's broader. Sorry, Pete, to interrupt. It's broader. The rule is judges should recuse when they're sitting on a case, gives the appearance of impropriety. Doesn't have to be impropriety, because we want to and we have to overreach that way. And by the way, lower federal court judges, in my experience, mostly have been really good about this. And they will recuse even if there's a slight doubt, because they don't want to be accused of violating this rule.
I guess my point is, or would be, the idea of a conflict of interest mattering the way it once certainly did in American politics, much less the way the appearance of impropriety is seen, because they're in the same world of ethics, I suppose. Those things don't matter the way that they used to. I was talking with my parents about this the other night, about just how an extramarital affair, would have sank any politician, Republican or Democrat. Gary Hart is a great example, right? But now that you can do anything. RFK, for example, had like several affairs, to the point where his wife may have, taken her life because of some of that. He wrote about him, and he's going to be fine. Obviously, Donald Trump, fine. And so the point being, things have changed in the window of...
Can I give you the best example?
Yeah.
Trump's the best example because the man...
Right. Trump is the best example because...
But here's one for you. So this is a crucial part of American history. I mean, this story, the entire world is different today, not just America, if this story comes out differently. So it's 1986, and Justice Lewis Powell, the swing vote on the court, announces his resignation. And there are, in fact, basically 4 liberals and 4 conservatives. So this is a big deal. And of course, Reagan wants Robert Bork to be on the Supreme Court. And Bork goes through the Bork hearings, and he bombs out, and he doesn't get it. And then Reagan nominates a Judge Ginsburg, not Ruth Bader, but a different Judge Ginsburg, very distinguished academic and judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals. Incredibly conservative, just as conservative as Bork. And if Ginsburg gets that seat, as opposed to Justice Kennedy, same-sex marriage is still illegal in this country today, in most states. And Roe would have been overturned in 1992. But Ginsburg had to withdraw from that nomination because he smoked pot as a law professor. Now, can you imagine? That was enough to torpedo him from a Supreme Court nomination because he smoked pot.
Well, it's funny. It's an interesting example. You're talking about Douglas Ginsburg, right?
Yes.
It's an interesting example about how culture has shifted. But I mean, it's not a great example because that's not seen. It wasn't seen that terrible then. I mean, it was obviously, but it's certainly not now. But like extramarital affairs and what appears to be improprieties, I'm saying like that doesn't seem to matter. Cheating doesn't matter. Winning matters. If you're the Federalist Society or if you're the supporters of these types of justices, you don't have any kind of ethical code. So why would you want one to be enforced on the judges?
Well, make no mistake. First of all, I want to finish that story because...
And it's not my opinion they don't have an ethical code. I'm saying if you don't care...
No, I know. I want to respond. But first I want to finish that previous thing. If Ginsburg gets it, we don't get Kennedy. If we don't get Kennedy, we don't get gay marriage. We don't get any rights for gay people, and we get Roe overturned 30 years earlier. If changing judges changes law, do we know what law is? All right. Now, fast forward to your thing. There is a code, Pete. There's an absolute code, and the Koch brothers believe in it. Alec believes in it, and there's no question in my mind. Justice Thomas believes in it. Although, if you had asked me a year ago, if you asked me 5 years ago, I might not have given you the same answer. The code is money. Their code is money. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing necessarily in general, but what they want, what these billionaires want, is money. And then they have some moral issues they may or may not care about, but they want money. And that money, as Senator Whitehouse has been trying to tell the American people now for years, with graphs and charts and diagrams and Twitter feeds and everything else, is that money has been going directly to wine and dine our conservative justice. Now, you've heard me criticize Ruth Bader Ginsburg for having basically weekly social events with Nina Totenberg. And I have the highest respect for both Justice Ginsburg and Nina Totenberg. I'm not sure that relationship was appropriate necessarily. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying it wasn't. But it wasn't based on money. It wasn't Nina Totenberg was not buying Ruth Bader Ginsburg, luxury items and taking her on for, The money part of this, which makes Justice Thomas, in addition to everything else he is, the world's biggest hypocrite. The money part of this, it's why my well-intentioned and well-known oldest friend I have from high school said to me, Eric, this book needs a chapter as to originalism is all bullshit. And you've made that clear in this book. How did these people who espouse bullshit get to where they are? And the answer to that question is the money we're seeing now given to these billionaires.
I understand. I think that's obviously true, and I understand that. But don't you think it's a bit simplistic in that specifically even Leonard Leo is a religious ideologue, and more than anything else, this, or as much as money, Christian nationalism and that movement and that agenda impacting Supreme Court rulings is it's as much of an impetus to, all these guys believe the justices believe the same stuff that these wealthy billionaires believe about what they view as kind of a theocracy, it would seem.
And that's an interesting question. And I could get in trouble if I had to tread here carefully. Seriously, you know me, Bill. I don't tread carefully, but I need to tread carefully here. I would be interested in seeing what levels, I don't want to phrase it that way. You're separating the money from the religion. You're not separating the money from the religion. And I guess I'm not sure. If I were a billionaire, let me put it this way. If you and I tomorrow, if someone said, you know what, I think this is a good analogy. If somebody said tomorrow, Pete Dominick and Eric Segall, those guys, they're great. Their politics are great. This is what Len Leo does. We're going to give them $1 billion for them to spread their word throughout the land. And with $1 billion, Pete, you and I could spread a whole lot of words. We would just not, and you and I would not just spread the word of climate change, your one of your main things, or campaign finance reform, or LGBTQ rights. If you and I had $1 billion, I would use some of that, and I think you would come along with me, or I would come along with you, to spread the word about how dangerous organized religion is to this country, and how this country is being really smothered by evil, discriminatory. It's why I wrote my piece in the Daily Beast years ago, that discrimination based on faith is still discrimination. That hate based on faith is still.
Yeah.
So you and I, we would do that. So
although I would be sure to not paint with as broad a brush as you about organized religion, there are plenty of amazing people who belong to organized religions. Of
course, I wouldn't deny that, but it's the institution, not the people. So what I've been saying to audiences,
the Episcopalians don't seem to be.
No. Look.
The universal Unitarians. There's a lot of amazing Christians that listen to this show and belong to, I think, good churches and stuff is all I'm saying.
How many of them are billionaires?
No, I hear what you're saying about the powerful, obviously, right. I think it's right-wing Christianity is as much as it is fundamentalist Judaism and
what I'm trying to say is I don't know what Leonard Leo's true beliefs are. I don't. And I don't know what this guy Singer's true beliefs are. And I don't know what Harlan Crow, the Bond character's true beliefs are. I don't know any of that. But my guess is, and I don't think this is a controversial statement, one can be truly a person of faith, as I'm sure these people are, but still think that the number one thing in life is money. And what Sheldon Whitehouse is trying to say, I think, is it's very hard to separate those two things. And what we're seeing is a Supreme Court of conservatives reflecting both the money and the religious aspects of these billionaires. We see the money part in Alito and Roberts and Thomas, and then before them, Scalia, Kennedy, and others, absolutely destroying campaign finance reform, so that they could use as the super PAC money to get what they want. So that's one part of it. And on the other part of it, we see, I mean, Pete, you have to look at this as if Justice Kennedy didn't exist, because he only existed on the Supreme Court because two other judges didn't get it, and one of those judges didn't get it for a fluke reason. And if Justice Kennedy didn't exist, there would be no gay rights at the national level in this country. And then they would have won everything. They would have won abortion. They would have won gay rights. They would have won campaign finance reform. I'm not even talking about guns yet and the gun industry profits, which all of these. So I do think the insight my friend threw at me, I did not take as seriously as I should have. That like everything else in American politics, what's really behind this is this money, and that's what Sheldon Whitehouse is trying to say. That's what Alex is trying to say. And I don't mind. I hope Alex doesn't mind this, and if he does, I really apologize to him. When I asked him, would Sheldon give me 10 minutes to try to convince him that the way to reach the American people now is not to criticize Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett and Roberts. The way to get to the people now is to criticize the institution and say this institution was badly designed from the start. It was terrible when they decided to Dred Scott and said blacks couldn't be citizens. It was terrible when they struck down child labor laws in 1918. It was terrible in Citizens United. It's terrible now, so on and so on. And he said to me, I hope this is okay to say, well, I don't think he would go for that because it muddies his vision, which is it's all about the money. And I get that. Like, I'm not criticizing it. I get it.
Yeah.
And I'm getting it more every day, to be honest. I'm getting it more every day. It really is about money. I'm
going to push back one more time, only because I talk to so many of these authors and experts, many of which you read and know yourself, who focused on, especially Jeff Sharlet, but Catherine Stewart and
I love
Sarah Posner, who I think you connected me with.
Yes.
And of course, Robert Jones. Kristen Dumez. There's so many people focused on this. You say you don't know what Leonard Leo's personal beliefs are. Is it not common knowledge? Here it is at sourcewatch.com. Leonard Leo is a member of the hardline Catholic organization Opus Dei. Are you still does that make you wonder what his personal religious beliefs are?
Well, so when Barrett was nominated, I'm skipping from Leo to Barrett, but you'll see why. When Barrett was nominated, there were two objections that some people made. One, not to the Supreme Court. When she was nominated to the Seventh Circuit, which everyone knew was her stepping stone to the Supreme Court. Ruth Ginsburg died or retired. There were two objections. One was her resume was no better than the resumes of hundreds of other law professors. That's all she was law. She never practiced law. So she was just not really. So she was just a law professor. And there were people with much better resumes. She had a Scalia clerkship, but her scholarly record was worse than most tenured law professors. She's a good scholar. I'm not saying that to impugn her. I'm just saying it was no different. But the other objection was she belonged to this far-right religious sect that is even crazier than Opus Dei. That's an outbranch. It's an outbranch of Catholicism where basically women are handmaidens. And when I raised that in public, everyone got mad at me and said, "You have no right to discuss their religious backgrounds."
Yes, you do.
And what I want to say is, it is a fact that Leo I think it's a fact that Barrett belongs to that group, or belonged, and I think it's a fact that Leo has not denied that he belongs to Opus Dei, whatever you just said. I'm not trying to get into their faith hearts, though. I don't know, Pete. People join organizations for different reasons,
right? Sure,
and connections. But even if I guess what I'm trying to say is, we can get to this problem without impugning his faith. And I've impugned Barrett's faith.
The reason why, I will follow your lead on this. The reason why you can, and it's okay to impugn their faith, is because their interpretation of their faith is not personal. It is now the law of the land, and often there's nothing even in their faith about it. It's an extreme, bizarre interpretation of something, like, your gay marriage impugns my straight marriage. Like, that's not religious, although they will say it is, and that's why it matters.
I agree.
Much less abortion or almost anything else, like women.
That's fair. Let me tell you how I try to handle that. That's fair. It's a fair statement. How I try to handle that, though, is the reason I wrote that piece that got me in some trouble in the Daily Beast was the point I want to make is I don't care what the motivation is for, let's say, A, destroying public schools, B, denying men and women, adult men and women, equal rights under the law in the LGBTQ transgender arena. I don't care what the motivation is. In fact, to me, the law should make a faith-based motivation for hate even less supportable than a non-faith-based hate. In other words, we don't have to go to the faith part of it. This guy said homosexuality is a sin and homosexuals are committing sins, and I don't want any part of that sin. I don't care where that belief comes from, Pete. It's irrelevant to me. It's a pernicious belief. It's a bad belief. It's immoral. If I said I think robbing banks is good, people should say, no, Seal, robbing banks is wrong. It's stealing. It's an immoral act. I don't care what the motivation is. Now, people will say, well, but Robin Hood stole from the poor to give to the rich. Okay, we can have that conversation. But we have to go that second step. There is no second step when it comes to faith, because Robin Hood would say there are people out there who can't eat bread, and there are princes out there eating cake, and I want to give the people eating bread or can't even get bread to eat something more. The people of faith, all they say is God said so. And once they say God said so, there's no argument. There's no longer a rational basis.
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I fully agree with you, but you're looking at it from what the legal outcome should be, as opposed to just the entire context of the conversation and the root of why things are and why people think that they are and where they make their arguments from and why that matters is obvious.
Here's how far away you and I are from the pulse of the world, though. Because what I wrote in that Daily Beast piece was the Catholic Church, an institution that does incredible good all over the world, feeds the hungry, feeds the poor, houses the poor. We could go on for, days on the good things the Catholic Church does. When I wrote that piece in 2017 or 16 or 19, whenever I wrote it, it was still the case, and is the case as we talk today, that women can't be priests in the Catholic Church. I don't care the reason. That's immoral, wrong, pernicious, and bad. And people inside the Catholic Church who are not actively trying to change it are really acting in a bad way. So I don't care that it's faith. I don't care what the reason is. You don't give me an institution that has trillions of dollars and say, oh, sorry, women, you don't get to lead it, no matter what. I don't care the reason. It's not the faith part that's bad. It's the not allowing women to be priests that's bad.
You could have so easily picked on the Southern Baptists because of the very recent expulsion of female pastors.
Yeah, no. In that piece, I wrote about Southern Baptists and I wrote about Orthodox.
Oh, you did. By the way, that piece is titled "Faith Doesn't Justify Discrimination Against Women," and it's at the Daily Beast by Eric Segall, 2015.
Yeah. This guy. So here's my deal on a very human level. Let's end it with this. This is one of the most human things I've ever said to you. It's not about law. It's just human. In 2023, not 1982 or 1789, but in 2023, when someone comes into court, a state institution, in this case a federal institution, funded by federal tax dollars, and says, I think homosexuality is a sin, I think homosexuals are sinners, and I don't want them in my place of business, solely for that reason, then nothing good should happen to them. In other words, they don't get to win. I don't care what the law is. I don't care what. They don't get to win. They should not get to win. That's not a legal argument that should win in 2023. Now, in the old days, what we would have said is they're asking for an injunction, meaning they're not seeking damages. They're asking for a rule from the court that we're allowed to fire. They actually hadn't even done this yet, Pete. It was all in advance. Doesn't matter. They wanted what's called equity. In common law, there were courts of equity and courts of law. Courts of law gave out money. Courts of equity gave out rules and orders. And there was a rule, Pete, and it was a sensible rule. When we combined those two functions after the Constitution was ratified. But before that, there were courts of law and courts of equity. And when you went into a court of equity, you can only win if you had, quote, clean hands. Meaning, it was always discretionary for the justice or the judge to say no to you if doing so would render an injustice. Didn't need to cite any law. Didn't need to cite anything other than in a court of equity, you have to have clean hands. It's a legal cliche you learn the first week of law school. To get equity, you have to have clean hands. When you come into court and say, I hate homosexuals, you don't have clean hands. And they should lose for that reason alone. And the Fifth Circuit should have said to them, sorry, gays and lesbians have been discriminated against in the world since forever. And fighting that is a compelling government interest. And therefore, you don't get the exemption you want, and therefore you lose. And that should have been the end of the case. Instead, they repeated his hate and said, yeah, you get to win. And Pete, when I read that opinion yesterday, it just made me already just so sad. I mean, that we're in this
will now be challenged and end up at the Supreme Court next year?
I think the gay rights community is going to have to get together, I think, and decide whether it's worth, because that's the Fifth Circuit, the most conservative circuit in the country. The other circuits may or may not go the same way on this. It applies to Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. There was a big fight, Pete, in the same-sex marriage days between the people you used to have on your show and who had and people who used to go on the POTUS network that was a LGBTQ network. The gay rights community didn't want to bring those cases. They thought it was too soon. And Ted Olson, the famous Ted Olson of Bush versus Gore fame, Solicitor General for George Bush, and I worked for Ted Olson. I worked for him and at a law firm. Ted Olson wanted to get together with David Boies, the liberal who represented Al Gore, as a team and say, no, gay rights are important. And they brought the case in California. And there was a big fight. Is this the right time? Ted thought it was, and so did I, because Ted knows Anthony Kennedy personally. Ted's from California. It was the right decision. I don't know if this is the right time to take this case.
I got it. The timing of when you decide to challenge something matters because the justice is on the court. We're going to make a decision, and if you can bet it's not going to be in your favor, then you shouldn't bring it because it's going to be the law of the land.
And in this case specifically, Bostock, which is the law that which is the case that applies the law to gays and lesbians in the first place.
Right.
It was a 5-4 case, and Gorsuch, maybe it was 6-3, I forget. But Gorsuch, it was 6-3 because Roberts joined it. But Gorsuch put that paragraph in or sentence in disclaiming how this applies to religious employers. So I'd be if God said, or if you said, I want a decision now, should they bring this case? My answer would be no.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
I think they'll lose.
Eric Segall, another very intellectually stimulating conversation that I was very dialed into, as I always am when I'm talking to you. I greatly appreciate your time, your friendship, and hopefully your wing gets better.
Interrupting you on purpose. I appreciate you more than you know that you give me the time to rant. Can I end on a funny story?
Sure. Love that.
Well, funny, sad, tragic, not tragic, but so I mentioned you.
Wow, that just took a turn.
I know. I mentioned you yesterday. I had a person ask me a very difficult personal question about something very, very important to my family. And it was difficult. And they said to me, and I have 10 minutes. The person said, I need this answer. I need it in 10 minutes.
What is this? What are you talking about?
That's all the details I'm giving you. And I said, I do some radio and some television and some podcasts. And I learned a long time ago from a good friend of mine, who you may have heard of, Pete Dominic, that sometimes Pete would ask me a question and I would say, I can't give you a soundbite answer to that. I'm sorry. It has to be at least 2 or 3 minutes or maybe more because that question is not answerable in 2 or 3 minutes. I can't answer your question in 10 minutes, you moron, because you asked me an incredibly difficult question about my family that I can't possibly give you the right information about in 10 minutes. You let me do this, Pete. And you letting me do this, meaning drone on incessantly without interruption, just changed my career completely. And I'll never have enough gratitude.
It goes both ways. Of course. Thank you very much for proving it today. Good content. Good content, baby.
Thank you, man.
Learned a lot. Always learn a lot.
Well, there you go. Eric Segall and I thank you very much for listening, for subscribing, for writing a review at Apple and Spotify. You can go check us out. YouTube.com/standupwithpete, on TikTok at Pete.Dominic. Enjoy your weekend if you're listening on the weekend or whenever you are. Stay in the moment, not the past, not the future. It's all we got. Talk to you later. Bye.
Stand up. Let the brave meet the challenge. Let the weak flee. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up. Oh, got to stand